So yeah, so I hope that helps.
Yeah, in fact I just had him on the channel recently, and he's almost finished with the first draft, and then he's got to go through editing. And he was like, "Look, it might sound like that's good, like I'm about to be finished, but he said editing a 5,400 page book is going to take at least a year, so don't expect it to be out too soon."
So yeah, so I hope that helps.
Well, Laura, would you like to come in and share any of your thoughts on what Mike has presented?
Hey guys, yeah, I just got home from a doctor's appointment, so if you see my eyes really big, that's because they've been dilated. And I want to catch up on Laura Robinson and Mike Licona, who I've both interviewed. I see that Mike Licona starts off here, and it looks like he gives his normal spiel of the historical evidence for the resurrection, mostly based on Paul. And looks like I've queued it up to where Laura comes in. Welcome. So I'm going to give my thoughts. I'm going to play this. I know Laura talks fast. I don't know if I can get away with this. Let's do 1.8x, and then hopefully we'll catch up to the live thing here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, being in a situation where you're talking with Michael Cohen about the resurrection is always a little odd. I feel like I'm on a very surprising list of people because I actually am a Christian and I do think the resurrection happened. So I think that is something that puts me apart from some of Michael Cohen's normal conversation partners on this front. But I actually do think it's not necessarily great for our theology to make a lot out of the idea that we can trace all of this, that we can trace the historical resurrection as an event back to this early Christian reporting. We have this rock solid reporting. I think what I hear Mike saying is that we really have to accept we have so much good historical data that the resurrection happened, that to say that we...
Why am I blocked from Capturing Christianity's channel? I have no idea. I think actually his mods, a lot of the moderators and a lot of apologetic channels don't like me because I purposely try to raise doubt in Christianity, and so they block me. Yeah, Mike Winger, I could make a list.
We have to exclude it from scholarly study is basically a procedural difference, right? That somebody says, no, we can't talk about the supernatural event.
Okay, listen to what Laura's saying here. She's basically saying that you can't get to the resurrection using the historical method.
We have to talk about only things that are natural, that have natural causes. So and that's almost not even a methodological argument. That's just a historical argument that we have really, really good testimony that people knew that Jesus was resurrected. And I actually just don't know if we want to make that claim as historians. Do we really have this amazing diversified evidence of the resurrection?
No, you don't.
What we have is that Paul says he saw Jesus, right? Paul says Peter, James, and John saw Jesus. And, I know that Mike got into a little bit later that
This is at 1.5x. Yeah, she talks too fast. I'll slow it down.
People remembered as being pillars of the faith afterwards. But in these later Christian texts, they don't repeat visionary experiences. They don't repeat reports about the resurrection. They just mean...
Yeah, they do think I troll. I don't even know exactly what the definition of trolling is. I do raise the emotions up in people with my questions. So if that's the definition of trolling, bringing emotions out of people, yeah, I guess I am a troll. But most of the time, I'm just asking short, simple questions.
That these people stayed involved in the church. So Paul says Peter, James, and John saw Jesus. Paul says 500 people saw Jesus. We don't have any other independent story about what this might have been. We don't have any reports of who these people were. We don't have their accounts.
She's sounding just like an atheist here.
We don't know what exactly they saw. It was definitely Jesus, but beyond that, not a lot of details. We don't know if they agreed on what they saw. We don't know if they persisted in their belief in what they saw after the fact. We just know that Paul says that he saw the 500. And then we have the Gospels, which are literally dependent on each other, and also second generation, secondhand at the very least, and they seem to all disagree with each other in some capacity, and we can argue about the significance of those, but at the same time, it's hard to make a great historical case that they tell us exactly what went down at the empty tomb, because they all say something a little different. So all this...
Yeah, and I think actually Licona agrees with Laura here that, and this is why he shies away from using the Gospels as evidence, and he focuses on Paul.
This is to say, it seems like the best source we have for this is Paul, and the things that Paul tells us about what other people saw at the resurrection. And if we decide that what Paul is saying is so convincing and so enormous, we're putting a lot of weight on this one figure that I think we wouldn't normally put on any individual figure. And I think that Paul's testimony to us sounds so amazing because we're Christians, and because...
Exactly right. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15, what Paul says, and even later on what the Gospels say, sounds powerful. And I wish Christians could... I think they understand this. It's powerful to you guys because you already believe it. And most of you, not all, come into the belief having a special feeling about it. And so a special reverence for the texts itself. And so when you see it, they go, how can anybody deny this is what happened?
So, we are caught up in the fact that we believe in this resurrected God, and we think we think it's amazing. And but the payoff of it is that we really just have this one man's testimony, and then all of basically the hearsay he collected. And I wouldn't even say that
Hearsay he collected.
that would be enough to say for sure that Jesus was left-handed, let alone to say that he was definitely resurrected. So
Whoa, that's a great line. Listen to that.
would be enough to say for sure that Jesus was left-handed, let alone to say that he was definitely resurrected. So
We don't have enough to say that Jesus was left-handed, let alone that he was resurrected. Wow, that's a quote. I gotta remember
I think we're already in a problem right off the bat with trying to figure out how this how we can testify to the resurrection in history. If I could just make a little plug for how I would think about this, because I actually don't think it's important for us as Christians to be able to say that we can recover what Paul saw on the Damascus Road as historians. I think that the work that we do as historians that assumes methodological naturalism is perfectly fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with it because it's very.
There's nothing wrong with using naturalism to look at the Bible.
It's based on the kind of ordinary history we do in day-to-day life, right? So in day-to-day life, we are dependent on natural explanations for what happens around us, right? So the police officers, when they solve a crime, if someone comes to a cop and says that my car was stolen, we assume that has a natural explanation, right? We would never entertain that some sort of supernatural thing is causing this.
Right.
And that's just history. That's just relatively recent history. So if we jack that back and we think that we're going to study history by roughly the same tools that we study normal history right now, I think it's totally natural to say that the best tool we have for doing history is methodological naturalism.
Right.
But I don't think that means that we need to be functional atheists when we look at history, because there's another way of doing history that we can draw on, and that's a theological account of history, right? So a theological account of history is not really about investigating what happened. It's about interpreting history after the fact. That we as Christians, we affirm that God has caught everyone up in
This is going to really irk the conservative fundamental type or evangelical type Christians. Like, no, but we got evidence. We don't have to just look at this theologically.
Every aspect of reality through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that God is involved in every aspect of history. So we don't really make a distinction between history God's involved in, natural, and history that God's not involved in, supernatural. We say God's involved in all of it.
Oh, Cameron,
but this
what are
is
you
a
doing?
retrospective claim. This is a claim that we make right now based on our own Christian presuppositions, and we can look back and narrate through history to figure out how God was involved, and we can ask theological questions about it. And I just don't know why that's not enough for when we're talking about the resurrection. Like, why can't we talk theologically about what Paul says happened, and let the resurrection itself not be something that we need to be able to reconstruct the way we can reconstruct the siege at Jerusalem, for instance? So that's that. I realized that I got fired off very quickly because I had a lot I wanted to say, and I started screaming, which is a thing I do when I'm very excited. But
yeah, that was at 1.3x, and it's real for most people. It sounds like 2x.
So yeah.
No, yeah. So Mike, how would you like to respond to that? It sounded to me, Laura, like you were saying that when it comes to these types of apologetic field that we
our faith in a form of knowledge that I think is routinely changing. All historical claims are necessarily tentative. We're always working with the best data we have. So I think if we really want to say that, we use the tools of history and we...
Yeah, that's interesting. She says that even using the historical method, things change, just like you hear so many Christians say that, oh, you can't trust science because they keep changing their minds on things. And, well, same goes with history. You don't know what will be dug up from the earth tomorrow, do you, Christians?
We recovered this historical event. We found out that it turned out Jesus was revivified. We always have to be open to the possibility we might find out something else that might challenge that assumption. That's actually not a great thing to place your faith in. And I would argue it's not even...
That uncertainty is not a great thing to place your faith in.
Really what the early church placed their faith in. They continuously had this experience of Jesus being involved with them in church meetings and in worship and in prophecy. And that's what they really went after. So I think that we might be making some modernist missteps in making Christianity all about stuff we can do in a university by saying that the best reason to be a Christian, the best reason to believe that Jesus is resurrected, is because we have this great data for it. And then, of course, I think the other part of this that makes it so difficult is the fact that we actually just don't have that good of data for it. We have Paul. And that's fine if
You're right. You guys, Christians, don't have great data, historical data. You have Paul. And you wouldn't believe Paul if Paul said 500 people saw a flying man. So why do you believe that he saw Jesus and these people saw Jesus?
We're talking about Paul, but it's not great for history.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, I just think this is a wonderful, beautiful example of the difference between a historian and a theologian.
Okay.
Because I'm approaching this historically.
By the way, for the record, I talked to some friends, Camille actually, and Cam prior to this yesterday. I think I said that I thought Licona was going to clean Laura's clock here. So I don't know if this is going to happen, but that was my prediction. And so this is, I think, where they start to get back and forth with each other.
Whereas I think you're looking at it more theologically. So let's talk about a couple of these things. You mentioned about it. We have to, as Christians, we interpret this, and God is acting in history here. I agree with you if we're looking at it practically speaking and theologically speaking. But as a historian, I can bifurcate the historical from the theological. So, for example, take the claim Jesus died for our sins. Now, I can't affirm that entire statement as a historian. I can take that by faith.
Hey, Catherine.
But I can adjudicate on half of that statement. I can adjudicate on the portion that says Jesus died or Jesus died by crucifixion. I can look at the historical data and conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion while saying the claim that Jesus' death atones for sins. Well, that's for the theologian. That's for faith, where faith comes in. But I can't verify that. I might be able to verify that Jesus believed his death atones for sins, or that the early Christians believed that Jesus' death atones for sin. But as a historian, I don't have the tools to be able to verify that Jesus' death indeed atones for our sins. Regarding methodological naturalism, I agree, but I think that
He agrees. He agrees you should use naturalism to look at the texts, the historical texts. But
methodological naturalism, we've got to take a little more prudent approach to it that's less infused with worldviews than is typically done. What most historians, or I should say biblical scholars, well, even some historians who deal with this, and the matter of historians and miracles is something that is a live discussion even amongst philosophers of history at this very time and has been for the last 2 decades, a living discussion. But a lot of philosophers of history, biblical scholars will say that you got to go with a methodological naturalism that if miracles involved, you can't adjudicate on it. Okay, so I think what a historian can do is they can look at the data and adjudicate on whether the event occurred. They just wouldn't be able, as a historian, to be able to adjudicate on the cause of the event.
I agree with Mike here.
So let me give an example. Let's suppose that astrophysicists have been keeping track of a comet for a decade, and within the last year they've determined that the comet is on a crash course with our moon, and they've determined that it is going to crash into the lunar surface at a specific time on a specific day. And at that time, the Hubble Space Telescope and a bunch of planetariums around the world are zoomed in on the lunar surface, and they watch that comet slam into the moon. And as the dust settles, there's a message on the moon's surface that says, and it's in Hebrew and in Greek, it says Jesus is Lord. Now, an astrophysicist could look at that, a cosmologist, and say, I have no idea how that happened, how that statement appeared in Greek and Hebrew on the moon's surface. But you wouldn't turn around and deny that the comet crashed into the moon's surface and left that message. You would say the event occurred, you would leave the cause undetermined because you don't have the tools as an astrophysicist to determine that God caused it. Now, of course, you could take your lab coat off as a physicist and say, but I do think that God is probably the best explanation. But in doing so, you're not using the tools of a physicist. In a similar way, I think the historian can look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and conclude that Jesus rose from the dead and leave the cause undetermined.
I agree with Mike Licona here. I think if, I always say 1 Kings 18 would be a great way to raise the confidence in that there's a supernatural realm or whatever you want to call it. Take water, soak a napkin, and pray in Jesus' name that it would be lit on fire. And if you got 5 independent organizations and cameras watching this, it's in the James Randi type test conditions. And let's say that happened yesterday. That's history. Yesterday's history. We can say, hey, we can use the historical method to say that soaked napkins can burn up in the name of Jesus. But whether Jesus really did it.
Now, I think you could take your tweed jacket off as a historian and say, well, yeah, God's probably the best cause for it, especially given some of Jesus' claims, but we can't have the tools as a historian to verify that God did it. Now, I can respond to a bunch more of these, but maybe rather than doing that.
But the thing is, what I just said with the napkin and the water, Laura's right. The evidence that you have for the resurrection of Jesus is pathetic. It's terrible. All you have is Paul, as Laura said. And I know Christians disagree with that. But if you just watch Licona, and he will focus in on Paul, and he very, very rarely talks about the Gospels when he's talking to non-believers. He will focus in on Paul, and there's a reason for that, because that's the only person who gives his name out and says, hey, look, I saw this. Me, Paul. Gospels don't talk like that.
Give Laura a chance to respond to these, and then we can just cover some of these other things you mentioned.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the place I'd want to start is that I definitely hear the idea that you could, historians could of course record some anomalous event in history where a person was dead and then they stopped being dead for whatever reason, and we don't really know why it happened, but it did happen. The thing I just don't know is if we actually have really good data to think that that has to have been what happened at the resurrection. Like the vast majority of the claims that Paul makes about Jesus in his letters, in the way in which Jesus is involved in the church, doesn't have anything to do with this historical moment where Jesus was dead and then he wasn't. They talk about the resurrection, but Paul just kept on interacting with Jesus. He says to the Galatians that Jesus was clearly presented before your eyes as crucified. They keep having these visionary experiences in the church.
I don't know that it's referring to a vision. Couldn't it just be the apostolic preaching?
I think the before your eyes thing is really suggestive, and we do have, the language in that passage of how did you receive the Spirit. I think there's probably something charismatic going on there. That would
yes, something charismatic going on. What does she mean by that? She's basically saying that, and for the Pentecostal Christians in the crowd listening, that Jesus appeared to them in the same way Jesus appears to a Pentecostal church on a Sunday morning. And you could have 500 people in that Pentecostal church who walk out of that church and say, I saw Jesus today. I experienced Jesus today. I felt Jesus today. I heard Jesus today. What if that's what Paul is meaning here?
Would be my hunch. And we also know that Paul had visions well after the fact. He went to the third heaven, for instance. So I would assume that this involvement with the resurrected Jesus continued well after that first Damascus Road experience.
But these appearances, even if we go with Galatians and say when Jesus appeared before your eyes, remember Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:8, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So in terms of resurrection appearances, it appears that Paul, whatever nature was the appearance to him, that was the last resurrection appearance of Jesus in that kind of form. And I don't know what these others, like these ecstatic experiences within group settings, I don't know of any, maybe you can provide an example. I don't know of a single example where that's referred to as an appearance of the risen Jesus.
One thing that does come to mind is the language in Matthew about where two or more are gathered, there I am with you. And, I think we tend to cross-stitch this onto pillows because we think it just sort of sounds like a nice reference to Jesus being...
Yeah, and the charismatic example is an example of, the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit, which people say today that Jesus appears to them.
Present in spirit. But when we have this language in Matthew that a lot of the authority of Jesus is being handed off from Jesus to the church, that on this rock I will build my church, and whatever two of you agree on will be, whatever you bind will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose will be loosed in heaven, or whatever you agree on, that this becomes this new law. There's this very strong norm throughout the Gospel of Matthew that whatever disciples do together and whatever they agree on, that is something that Jesus is still intimately involved with. And you also see this showing up again in John, that in John you've got the language of, the Holy Spirit will help you to remember everything I said. And, I think we can all see by the extent to which the tone changes a bit in the teachings in John versus the teachings in the Synoptics, that probably some of that was not strictly speaking remembering, but also interpreting and hearing new prophetic words from Jesus.
Yeah, some guy, Paul is our ace. I didn't play that part. I came late, got home just recently, missed the first bit. But I did a video on how with Mormonism, Joseph Smith is the ace. It's the same thing. It's Joseph Smith is making a claim that he saw Jesus, he saw Moroni, they told him stuff. Paul's saying, I saw Jesus, I experienced Jesus, Jesus told him stuff. Now, of course, you can say we got a whole bunch of better evidence for Joseph Smith to say that he was, a man of not good character. But what if there could be stuff like that? Paul could have been like a really terrible guy off, when he's off record. We just don't have record of that.
I think this is something that probably went on very well after the fact in the resurrection. And I also don't think that's something we need to be ashamed of or embarrassed of as Christians.
I agree, yeah. But I don't know of anywhere where those are referred to as resurrection appearances. They're manifestations of the Holy Spirit, for sure. The Holy Spirit will remind you. The Holy Spirit I'm sending the Comforter to you. Yeah. But I don't see these as being recognized or claimed to be appearances of the risen Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what there's probably some distinction to be made here between.
The older I get, the more I'm not saying you have to do it this way or that you should do it this way or anything like that. But the older I get, isn't it likely that Paul just lied purposely to deceive? It's like that explanation solves so many things for the Christian, I think. And well, maybe not, but it's still how many cases do we have in history of people lying to serve a cause, to get a certain thing done? And how many cases in history do we have people rising from the dead? It's this, to me, just numerator, denominator. And historical is based on probabilities. the historical method. Just looking at it like that, you could say, yeah, Paul lied. He was a liar.
Between what's an apostle and who sees Jesus, because you do see, it looks like those are things that Paul is using in different categories, even though the thing that gives him this apostolic authority is being one who saw Jesus. Yep. I don't know. I'm also not totally convinced that Last of All is doing that kind of canon closing work there. I'm not sure if I get that, if Paul is speaking from his perspective. I'm just not.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward it a bit here.
In salvation history, that just seemed a little premature from somebody writing so early on and who doesn't think that history is going to be around that much longer. So, yeah.
Let me ask you this: how do you imagine Paul thought of Jesus' resurrection? Was it a bodily event?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely physical.
I know how Richard Carrier would answer that.
Physical in some sense, but the amount of distinction he makes about what the body is like after the resurrection, it's a lot more complicated than a revivification. It's not what happened to, it's not what's narrated in Lazarus' story.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Do you think that Paul imagined that the nature of Jesus' resurrection was such that wherever Jesus was buried, that body was gone when he was resurrected?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough thing to say about, just because.
And was it on earth or was it in the third heaven?
Paul doesn't give us a lot to work with. Obviously it doesn't take very long before his interpreters say that definitely had to be the case. I don't know. The obvious analogy is what Paul says about our bodies at the resurrection. But in there, I think the data can be a little ambivalent, because on one hand, we have, in a moment we will all be changed, but we also have this image of how the body dies, and then this body dies like a seed, and then this very unlike thing comes from it. Mm-hmm. So I think you could probably take the data both ways. I say the creeds when I go to church. I affirm that there's a historical resurrection, but I don't think it's necessary that Paul had that figured out. I don't think Paul really wanted to be resurrected in his body. He says a lot of very nasty things about it. Well, he says
I think that's what 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 5:8 is about. I think he's fearful. He's fearful he's going to be disembodied when he dies, because Christ will not have returned by then. Let me throw something past you, because I do think that Paul imagined Jesus' resurrection in a physical bodily sense. Yeah. That the corpse would have been gone from where it was buried, and that it would be transformed into a resurrection body. Let me tell you why. And even my friend Bart Ehrman would say that too. He thinks Paul's crystal clear on this. You've got 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 17, where Paul says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope. And then he says, Christ will bring back with him those who belong to him, right? Yeah. And then he says, then the trumpet will sound, and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Now, wait a minute. If he's bringing the dead back with him, then how are the dead in Christ going to be raised? Because he's bringing them back with him. Yeah. I think that's pretty easy, because Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, for 2 Corinthians 5:8. So he imagines that when a person dies, of course, they leave their body, the spirit leaves their body, and he imagines that body, the spirit, going to be with Christ in heaven. Yeah. Even in Philippians 21, 22, where he says, I'm in prison and I don't know which to choose. I have the desire to die and be with.
For those of you who weren't raised in Christianity, there's the resurrection bodies are different than your former bodies. How are they different? Nobody knows. I don't think people know. So the question is how did Paul envision Jesus' resurrected body? Was it really just like us? Was it sort of physical, but a little bit different? What was it?
Christ, but to remain on in the body is much more necessary for your sake. So his conception of what happens at death is the spirit leaves the body and goes to be with Christ. And then when Christ returns, he brings the spirit of those who belong to him back with him. Those spirits are then put back into the corpses, which are resurrected and transformed.
So when Jesus returns, the spirit's put back into those corpses. And so if I know Christians today, seriously, I do, who are against cremation because of this. And because you need a body to be transformed into your heavenly body. And then some other Christians say, no, that's crazy. God can use just a little piece of ash as your body.
Into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. So it's a bodily resurrection. It's like what Paul says in Romans 8:11. The Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So I think Paul, whatever the nature of his experience was, he still believed that Jesus had been raised bodily, physically from the dead. And if this is what Paul believed, remember, he's preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. So this is what they believe. And that seems to me that a physical bodily resurrection would be very congruent.
So I disagree with that. I do not think Paul was preaching the same gospel as the other apostles, if you believe the gospels, because Paul's gospel is that there's nothing you can do to be saved, to save yourself. There's nothing. Salvation is by grace. It's faith. It's lest any man should boast. But if you read the Gospels, you read Jesus' own words time and time again. Jesus never uses the word grace, never talks like Paul talks. He does the opposite. The book of James is more similar to the Gospels. He basically says it's what you do. It's you got to give to the poor, sell your possessions, follow me, take up your cross, all these things. It's not like this attitude change of you just kind of sit in your chair and then you just concentrate and accept it. It's not like that at all.
With what we find in the Gospels, where they can touch him. He appears before their very eyes. And yeah, it is a transformed physical corpse that can do all kinds of things like appear and disappear at will.
Yeah, what's he talking about? It's a transformed corpse. In the book of John, Jesus walks through walls. It doesn't say that literally, but I think even Christians admit that, you got a closed room and then all of a sudden Jesus is there.
But so it's still physical. It's more congruent with the empty tomb narratives in the Gospels than it would be with, say, they were just experiencing the presence of Christ when they got together and worshiped.
Yeah, well, no, and I definitely agree that it's more than the spirit of Christ, but I also think I think sometimes we buy into a bit of a false dichotomy when we're talking about the physicality of the resurrection, that either it was a real resurrection, either the body of Jesus got up and then it was alive, so you would not have been able to find his body anymore because it was running around doing things, or it was this sort of metaphorical resurrected in our hearts, sort of a lame, not terribly interesting resurrection. But I think that's a mistake, because that's not always the way that materiality in ontology works.
Well, something just popped in my mind. For those who are former Christians or are Christians in here, who were the very first people to see the resurrected body of Jesus? The correct answer is, I think, if you believe this actually happened, were the guards at the tomb. Right? There was guards at the tomb. Unless you believe Jesus rose from the dead prior to the Sunday, which wouldn't make it a full 3 days. Yeah. And this is like something that I think a lot of Christians forget, that Jesus technically appeared to the guards way before anybody else. And yet the guards never wrote a gospel about it. Isn't that interesting? You know why the guards never wrote a gospel about it? Because they got paid off. Talk about conspiracy theories, right? They got paid off to be quiet. It's like life-changing event, and a little bit of money changed their minds.
World, spirit, pneuma is still stuff. It's very light, airy stuff, but it doesn't exist on some sort of metaphysical plane for them. So, when Paul talks about, about angels having one kind of glory or the stars having one kind of glory, I think there's every reason to think that that's the kind of material that Paul thinks resurrected bodies are made out of, and not necessarily the part of you that died. So, and again, I'm not saying that it has to be true that I don't know if Paul knew an empty tomb tradition or not. I think there's a possibility. I don't know if Paul knew about the idea of the body missing or not. I think there's a possibility.
Why does Laura say such things? If you're a Christian listening, why is she doing this? It's like, of course Paul knew about the tomb. Well, Laura's saying these things because as a historian, you read the text carefully, and Paul never mentions a tomb.
I don't think it's essential for what he's preaching, though. I think that's a difference. And again, I'm not saying it doesn't mean that we as Christians can't believe it. I'm not saying that it's not something that should be part of our creeds. But I think we need to be honest about the limitations of what Paul is interested in. Paul is always very contingent. Paul is not laying out these systematic theologies to cover all of his bases. He's talking about the things that are most important at any time.
By the way, when this is actually over, this is live right now. When this is over, there's a good chance Laura will find her way in here, and I'll invite her on.
So I think if we're trying to draw a lot out of this and say, that Paul would have talked about this with the Jerusalem church, and he would have made sure he was saying the same things they were. They would have said things that Paul didn't say, that they would have seen things Paul didn't see, and would be attesting to this. I think we're ignoring a little bit the extent to which Paul is a contingent theologian. Paul talks about the things that are immediately in front of him. So that also seems like another thing we need to pay attention to.
I agree with you. And I agree with you that Paul does come at it that way as well. Mm-hmm. And here again, I think we see the difference between the approach of a theologian versus the approach of a historian, because I'm interested in the historical question here. And I do think that the data is sufficient to conclude certain things about what Paul believed. I mean, it seemed to me, Laura, and please correct me if I've misunderstood you here.
What Paul believed and what actually happened in the past are two different things. I think we're all agreed about that. Someone can truly believe, sincerely believe, deeply believe something happened in the past or even in the present and be mistaken. Some people call this gaslighting, but our faculties can be so skewed at times that what we think is actually happening in reality is not.
Because I respect you. I love your advisor, Joel Marcus, and also your reader, Mark Goodacre. I've never met Joel Marcus.
Who's winning right now? I say it's a draw.
But Mark Goodacre's a friend, and I really love the guy, and he's a fantastic scholar. Even though I think he's wrong, you guys could very well be right with the Fowler hypothesis. I'm just not convinced of it at this time. But anyway, great guy. You're great. But when Paul says he met with Peter, James, and John, ran the gospel message with him, and they gave him the approval that he's preaching on message with what they're preaching. And when we have external corroboration that Paul's teaching the message of truth, I mean, don't you think that is sufficient to say that when we're hearing Paul, at least the gospel message, not necessarily all of his theology, but on the gospel message, we are likely hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. They're proclaiming the same thing. I'm not saying absolute certainty, because when you do history, you don't get certainty.
So Paul, what Mike is saying here is he's almost like trying to bring in more sources, more independent sources that what Paul said can be trusted by alluding to the apostles, the Jerusalem apostles, the disciples, and so forth. But this is just Paul's words, right? So this is Paul saying, hey, look, I met with these people, and yeah, we're all friends, and we're agreed that this is the gospel message. This is what happened, blah, 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 blah. Trust me, I met with them, and they gave me the thumbs up. Trust me. I'm okay. I'm telling you the truth.
But you do get probability, and I think it's highly probable based on our data that Paul is proclaiming the resurrection. The apostles are proclaiming it. And given what Paul seems to believe about resurrection, it seems to be a physical.
People are talking about me in the other live stream chat.
Bodily event.
I
Ours
think
is, right?
It can be physical and bodily without necessarily involving a person's corpse, I think. I think this is a live interpretive possibility. I'm not saying it's what Paul necessarily means. I just think it's on the table. So, but as for, Paul saying that, he went to the Jerusalem church and he wanted to make sure he was preaching the same thing as them, I think we're a little bit reading Paul against Paul.
Yes, this is what I said.
I think that the reason why Paul brings this stuff up is to emphasize accord with the Jerusalem church, because he only talks about it when they're all mad at each other, right? It seems like, if anything, there's a lot of dispute happening there, and there's a lot of disagreement happening there. And Paul never gives us any clear indication that they disagreed about some core gospel message, but apparently at some point they did, because they didn't really know what to do about Jew-Gentile lines. They didn't really know exactly how Gentiles became part of the church. So,
by the way, we're at 211 viewers on my channel. They're at 379. Wouldn't it be a miracle from God if the viewers exceeded theirs on the actual show?
It does look like some important stuff didn't get discussed. So we just don't know what they talked about. Paul gives us a nice summary in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says that, that Jesus died according to sins and was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. That's all sort of that central stuff there. But a lot of the details we just don't know.
I agree with you. I agree. I think we're in agreement here. So, and I
Mike's in agreement that a lot of the details we just don't know. That's a good quote.
That doesn't mean what I'm claiming isn't that they agreed with Paul. Paul agreed with them on everything. Obviously, there were disputes. They're in Galatians 2.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward. This is a little boring to me.
Reality is swallowed up with immortality. So it is a transformation of our corpse. The dead will be raised and we will be changed. It seems that's bodily. That would leave behind an empty grave. And let me throw, you said about the Gospels, literarily dependent on one another.
Yes.
I'm sure there's some literary dependence. I mean, that's obviously
a lot
problem, of course.
Some. What's the percentage? 60, 70%, 80%?
I differ from Mark Goodacre in thinking that even though John probably knew of the synoptics, I think he writes independently of them. And in fact, you've got Craig Keener, a friend of mine, who has written a pretty robust commentary on the Gospel of John, where he focuses mainly. He's more interested in historical stuff than theological stuff, but he does some bean counting as well.
Whoa, Keener's more interested in historical stuff than theology. I beg to differ. He wrote a book on miracles.
Well, scholars, and he will say that the majority of critical scholars today Although they reject the traditional authorship of John the son of Zebedee being the author of John's gospel, the
Tom, I'm at 1.5x. I'm trying to catch up to the actual live show here.
majority of critical scholars do think that whoever wrote John's gospel, they used one of Jesus' disciples, an eyewitness, maybe a minor disciple of Jesus, as their primary source. So John's gospel would still be rooted in eyewitness testimony. And I just had a master's student who wrote his thesis on some prolegomena on Mark, and he consulted over 200 critical scholars since 1965. And he found that the majority of them today, a small majority, but still a majority, think that the evidence is persuasive enough to conclude that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter. And if they are correct, then we've got Mark and...
So he's saying 51% roughly of scholars think that Mark's source was Peter. I wonder what the other 49% say. That it's maybe Paul?
John, that at minimum are rooted in eyewitness testimony, and both of them speak of an empty tomb, which is congruent with Paul's belief that Jesus had been raised physically from the dead.
Yeah,
Laura, are you chomping at the bits to respond to that, or can I ask you a question?
See, but none of this is... it's so frustrating because, and this is why I love the Flying Man, even though so many Christians don't get it. It's like you would not believe a similar claim in an outside book based on this type of evidence. You just wouldn't. I really believe you wouldn't.
It's all related.
Not a lot. I mean, I don't really want to get into a big conversation about who wrote the Gospels, because I think that there's a really good case to be made that I think the apostle who seems to be behind Mark actually seems more like Paul than Peter.
That's what I said.
That's all there is to it. So we don't have to.
So you two you're both Christians, but what we're
Isn't it amazing how Laura, the Christian, sounds so much like Doug, the atheist?
kind of like looking at in this show is like, well, what are some of the differences between two Christians that have different views? And so I think one of the biggest differences that we're kind of seeing right now is methodology. And one of the things that Mike has said.
You're approaching the circumstances of Jesus' death and what the early Christians thought they saw. Of course, this is a historical question. Of course, this is something that we are engaging with as historians. And again, I think that a big part of why it is so important to foreground this, to just be honest about the fact that we do presuppose Jesus when we look back at these resurrection claims, and to let that do our speaking for us is because history can't get us there. History really can't.
Hey, you're very welcome, Amin I Fury. Sounds like a new name. Good to see you here.
Get us to a lot of the most key ideas that we have as about Jesus and who he was and the work he did, and that's okay. That's fine. We just need to be really honest about that. And I think when we're doing history, it's okay to let methodological naturalism be normative. And even if you don't want to say, well, then now you're letting procedural details take over here, we have to do a lot of groundwork to get us to more than one witness of the resurrection, and that seems like a problem to me.
Oh, another great quote. We have to do a lot of groundwork to get to more than one witness for the resurrection. I've been saying this for years. In fact, we have a challenge. Find me anybody who writes in the first person with their own hand that they saw they saw the risen Jesus. And you only get Paul and maybe Revelation chapter 1.
And I also do think, again, I think that we're not talking enough about
both of which are visions, a lot of historians say.
Divisions in the early church about stuff. Paul says in Galatians 2, he also says that Peter was not walking in the truth of the gospel. This was a very serious dispute. And the fact that table fellowship isn't really a huge deal to us doesn't mean it wasn't really central to them. So I don't want to impose our assumptions about what the most important things must have been onto them, and they must have all agreed on this. Just because when we look at the data, it's a bit more complicated than that.
One of the questions I have, and Mike, if you can just real quick.
Can I?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Mike's irked.
We only have one eyewitness that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and that is Caesar himself in his commentary on the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't even mention it.
This also bothers me. I'm triggered. I'm triggered right now. It's like, okay, there's only one eyewitness that I have a pet dog, and yet nobody doubts that. That's good enough, right, Laura? I got one eyewitness that I have a pet dog. Wars happen all the time. We only have one eyewitness for this particular action in war. I think Christians can see the difference here. Now, what if I told you my dog could fly, like literally unaided? My dog has wings. You don't believe me? I have one eyewitness. Do you believe it? See the difference? Christians, I'm talking to you. See the difference? And so when every time you say stuff like, oh, if you're going to throw this out, then you've got to throw out all of history or most of history, please know that He's going to sound like Vodi Bakum here. I'm going to quote, I'll quote Vodi Bakum. When you say things like this, you sound like an idiot. And I'm not calling Mike Licona an idiot here, but I'm surely, even guys like Sean McDowell get this, that you can't compare the two and say, oh, we have one eyewitness for this event and we don't doubt it. And now we have one eyewitness, Paul, for the resurrection. Why should we doubt it? That. It's because of the low prior probability of these events that we see in our everyday common experience. And I hope most Christians see that.
He mentions himself being in Ravenna, and then
We don't need to hear about that.
all we can conclude is that there were some people back then, like Cicero and Suetonius and Plutarch and Dio, who believed that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon.
Yeah.
Certain time and
All irrelevant.
who was in charge of Rome. And these are all things that I think we can have pretty good, we can get some more data about that. But the primary sources of how we know about the resurrections are personal. But the primary sources of how we know about the resurrections are personal, individualized testimony, and people saying that they saw Jesus. It doesn't really look, except for giving
when we're
the
talking
Spirit.
about testimony, though, how do we know who was ruling Rome at that time in a power struggle? Because of testimony.
Yeah, but also when you have, this is not a subjective experience, though. This is an objective experience that people are keeping records of these things.
I'm seeing that it's out of sync now.
And
That's
Jesus
what we got
did
with Paul in the Gospels. People are keeping records of what happened. The Gospels are 4 lives. They're biographies of Jesus.
But
Right?
I'm
Whether
Yes, but
you believe
most
them
of
or
them-
not, they're still
I'm not out of sync, am I?
biographies of Jesus. That's the genre.
I definitely agree, and that's all very good evidence that Jesus had this historical ministry, and that Jesus went around doing and was, widely known to be performing miracles and teaching and doing all these wonderful things. But I think once you get to the resurrection,
I don't think I disagree with Laura here. I don't think we have tremendous evidence about Jesus's ministry. Again, our primary source, our earliest source, is Paul, and he speaks almost nothing about the ministry of Jesus.
things get a little bit more complicated, specifically because they do disagree. Because we do have this literary dependence and the extent to which these gospel writers do disagree with each other so much. But when we're talking about Paul, the
They
things
disagree
that
on Caesar crossing the Rubicon. They disagree quite a lot on the assassination of Caesar as well. Appian, Dio, Cicero, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Tacitus, Velleius, they all disagree on many details about the assassination of Caesar, yet we wouldn't question whether Caesar was assassinated.
Sure. I mean, this is I'm not super.
Again, this is, I don't know, maybe you guys can help me. What is the best way to help Christians deal with this? Like even Licona is saying, well, we got one eyewitness, or we have eyewitnesses that disagree, but we still know the gist that Caesar was assassinated. And so we can use that gist to say that Jesus Christ was resurrected. Like, can't you see the difference between those two claims and that one needs more evidence than the other? If you can't see that as a human being, you're going to be in trouble in life. You're going to end up believing all sorts of nonsense.
We're great on pre-imperial Roman history, so I'll take your word for that on that. But I do think what you can have, though, is when you have radical disagreements about how exactly something happened. There aren't any witnesses that disagree that Caesar died of old age, right? When you have those sort of extreme differences, that does change things. So
And we don't have any differences that says the tomb was not empty or that
did Jesus
not
appear?
rise from the dead.
Yeah, but did Jesus appear at the tomb or not? Like, that's a pretty important difference. I think if people saw Jesus or not at the tomb, according to Mark, nobody did. According to Mark, the women ran off and they.
I'm going to refresh here, see if that gets it back in sync. Actually, you know what? I'm going to fast forward to about there.
Necessarily known about them. So did Paul know that this was the central claim of Christians? I don't know that he did. I don't know that I don't know that that's what would have stirred him up against this. It looks like he was sort of doing this a little bit under the table. That's more my concern. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that straight out of the gate, very early on, Christians started proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's no question about that. The question I have is that something that Paul got from Christians? Is that a claim Paul got from Christians? I just don't know. I'm just not sure if there's good evidence for that.
I agree. I don't know that we can know exactly why Paul was persecuting the Christians. I mean, I think we can be certain it's because he didn't like the message of Jesus, right?
Oh, he didn't like the message of Christians. It seems like when Stephen comes around, it's like the temple is very involved in some early Christian preaching, and that creates a problem. Of course, Jesus is famous for trashing the temple right before he died. So it seems like some anxiety about the temple.
By the way, there is some doubt that Paul even persecuted the Christians. Like Paul says he did, But if you read in the book of Acts, Paul was supposed to be, what's the guy's name? He was supposed to be protege of some famous Jewish scholar guy. And that guy said, no, leave the Christians alone. So if Paul did persecute the Christians, he did so basically by rebelling against his mentor.
Stability is involved. So yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a variety of factors, but I think that when we're talking about the life of Paul, I don't know if the idea that he had some sort of solid knowledge of early Christian doctrine before he confirmed, that's something I'm just not so sure about. So or even
I want to talk more about the differences in methodology, because I think that's kind of like the core of the differences between the two of you. And to me, I see kind of a middle ground. And so let me know what your thoughts are, both of you. So Mike, it seems to me like I'm a philosophy guy. You too. Well, Mike, a historian, and Laura, theologian. Would you call yourself a historian as well, Laura?
I'm a philosophy guy.
I would definitely call myself a historian. Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, coming from your perspectives, you're both entrenched in history, and I'm more of a philosophy guy. So here's a way that I think
a lot of my work was in the philosophy of history.
Yeah,
there you go. So Mike, would you call yourself an evidentialist in the philosophical sense?
What do you mean? Tell me what you mean by evidentialist, so that we're all clear on that.
So what I mean by that is that your beliefs about something, or to be more technical, your credences ought to not surpass the available evidence that you have. So whatever the evidence is that you've got to proportion your beliefs to the evidence.
Oh, you got to apportion your beliefs to the evidence. Love that.
Would you accept that view?
No, not necessarily.
Whoa. No, not necessarily. Now, why does he say that? I have a feeling it has to do with the intertestimony of the Holy Spirit.
I guess then you could say, well, what constitutes evidence? There is evidence outside of historical evidence, of course. I think that Laura would be absolutely correct if she's saying, we could sense Christ's presence and believe that he rose from the dead. Yep. I'm fine with that.
Laura, would you
see? Yeah, that's what I said.
And I'm interested in the question, what can we, if we take a look at it purely as historians, what kind of conclusions can we look at? And is it rational to believe the resurrection? And is there sufficient evidence to think, as a historian, that he rose from the dead? That's kind of where my interest is there. So,
okay, well, then maybe there's not a middle ground. It's just that everyone's on the same ground. Well, let me ask my question to Laura. So would you accept that thesis, or would you reject it? What I called evidentialism. Evidentialism.
Yeah. I guess I don't know enough about the technical terminology to want to sign on the dotted line. Can you give me a concrete example from the Gospels, maybe?
I'm going to be honest. I'm so bad at coming up with examples on the spot.
Okay.
I'm like the worst person in the world for this.
This is why Cameron doesn't debate. He's really bad at coming up with examples on the spot. Like take the Transfiguration. Do you think one should believe that based on the evidence? How about in the Gospel of John, when it talks about Thomas, it's only mentioned once. Should we take that as the gospel truth that happened if it's only mentioned once?
So, for this task. Well,
you see, Laura, he's a philosopher, so he studies the questions nobody's asking. Right?
Exactly. Well, so no, let me put it this way. So I think that it sounds to me, Laura, like,
how does Doug have 6 times less subscribers but almost the same number of live viewers as Capturing Christianity? Camille, the answer is talent.
You're saying that, okay, history is important, but it can't get us all the way, and so it's more just about like having faith in Christ is the most important thing. And if we get to if we put too much of an emphasis, or we think that apologetics or historical investigation is too important, that's going to be bad or detrimental potentially in the long run, because the historical side of things is just not there. It's not gonna get you there.
I think that's probably roughly it, except I don't quite agree with the characterization of where faith comes from. Okay. I think that just the general issue with this is that the historical data for knowing that Jesus was resurrected in the way that we confess him right now, the historical data is just not there. So I think that's a really big problem for this. And the bigger methodological problem is
how can a Christian like Laura say that? For those of you who don't know who Laura is and have come late, and she can say this, and I think even a part of Licona agrees with her. I'm quite sure of that. She can say this because she's experienced Jesus today. She doesn't need no stinking historical evidence from 2,000 years ago. Why would you even think about accessing the historical evidence from 2,000 years ago when you have a personal relationship with Jesus today? And here's my theory. My theory is the deeper that the belief that Jesus is real with you today, and even if you've experienced what you think are miracles and what you think you've seen as demons, like Mike Licona with the trash can lids and so forth, although he didn't see that, some friends of his did. The deeper you have of those experiences, the less you need the historical evidence.
just from a Christian perspective, is that this treats Jesus as though he was a lot dead than he's a lot deader than he actually is, right? You know, if we're sort of treating this as this 2,000-year-old historical event akin to the Jewish war that we have to go back and dig up and go find, that's not really how Christianity works. Christianity is a lot more about the sacraments and the church and the community. So I think that.
So tell me then. So if you don't think that the history can take you all the way, so help me. Like, what fills in the gap? Because you're a Christian, you're a confessing Christian. So if the history can't do it, like, what takes you the rest of the way?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the classic example of how to be a Christian is from Paul. So, you know, Paul is a person who was doing just fine in life. He was progressing in Judaism beyond his years, and he had this revelatory, out of nowhere experience that changed everything for him, and it changed his perspective on the way everything needed to go. And what Paul did not do was go perform some forensic analysis to go figure out whether this thing he just saw, or this vision he just saw, or this person he just saw, he did not go back to confirm whether or not this was whether or not a historical resurrection had happened, or whether or not
Great point. There's no evidence that Paul went back to investigate forensically. Okay, well, show me where this tomb was. Walk me over here. Where's the exact location? None of that type of research, Paul says. It's more the revelation, the inspiration.
He could accord this with what people who knew Jesus in life could. These are all things that as moderns we probably all wish he had done, but he just didn't. He just headed off to the desert and he was there for 3 years, and he didn't really bother about seeing any of the disciples for another 3 years. And then when he did, it was only 2 weeks. So I think that generally this is the example of what it means to be a Christian, is that faith is either given to you or it isn't. And when God does give you faith, it's the thing that changes your life. It's the thing that you respond to. It's the thing that you turn around from. So I think that's a big...
By the way, the Bible does say that faith is a gift, and Christians even argue about that because... they don't like the idea of faith is purely a gift that God gives. Then anybody like me who's not a believer, whose fault is it? Well, not mine. I never got the gift of faith, and it takes faith to believe it.
And part of why I'm not a big fan of going back and looking for this historical reference for the resurrection, just because it seems very out of character and out of step with how Paul did things. So,
I agree with you, Laura. I agree with you when you say through historical investigation, we cannot get to Jesus rose and the way we confess him. I agree with that. But
what? Did he just admit what?
Historical investigation, we cannot get to. I agree with you, Laura. I agree with you when you say through historical investigation, we cannot get to Jesus rose and the way we confess him.
Mike Licona just admitted you can't get to Jesus rose from the dead using the historical method. That's a time-stampable moment.
I agree with that, but I do think historical investigation can get to Jesus rose.
What?
But historical investigation cannot make theological conclusions. And you said,
did he not just contradict himself?
Jesus rose and the way we confess him. I agree with that, but I do think historical investigation can get to Jesus rose. But historical investigation cannot make theological conclusions.
Am I wrong? Am I insane right now? Did he just say, I agree with you, Lord, we can't get to using the historical method that Jesus rose, but what we can get to is that Jesus rose? Am I...
And you say Paul didn't go back to verify, after his experience of the risen Jesus, he didn't go back to verify that he'd actually risen, that there was an empty grave, an empty tomb. I think if I had an experience like Paul, I wouldn't need to do that either. But that's, I think, is beside the question. It's not whether what Paul had to go back and do. Paul, I think we both agree that the evidence strongly suggests that Paul had an experience that convinced him beyond any doubt that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to him. And so
and tons of millions, billions of people have experiences that I think Mike Licona would say have a false attribution, that what people say has caused this experience, they're wrong. It wasn't Jesus who caused your experience. Maybe it was a demon, but it wasn't Jesus.
It does seem, at least in my view, I think we can show that there's good reason to think that Paul believed that Jesus was raised physically, bodily, that would have left behind an empty grave of some sort, and that this is what the Jerusalem apostles believed. So the question, I think, for the historian, and the one that Dale Allison asked, is what on earth or in heaven would have led them to believe that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead? That, Allison says, is the prize puzzle of New Testament research.
Thank you for the donation, EduCoot.
And I think that's where, as historians, we have to then formulate hypotheses, weigh hypotheses, and see which one is the best explanation. So we don't have to stop at just saying, well, Paul believed, that the disciples believed. And I'm not saying that our faith is dependent. I want to be clear there, because I think I don't want to be misunderstood by you here. I don't think our faith needs to be dependent on whether we can proof with reasonable certainty, what we mean by proof here, not absolute, but whether we can show that the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't think that our faith needs to be dependent on that. Now, if the evidence pointed away from Jesus' resurrection, then I don't know that I could remain a Christian. But I don't need the resurrection to be confirmed in order to be a Christian. But as a historian, I'm interested to see whether it can be confirmed. And
that speaks volumes right there.
That's why I think that
he needs evidence to walk away from Christianity, but he doesn't necessarily need this type of evidence to stay in it. That tells you right away that all this, like if I was to talk to Mike Licona about Christianity, and if someone paid me $1 million to try to deconvert him, why in the world would I even touch the historical method after him saying that? He's basically admitting that there's something else driving him. And my guess is it's his personal experiences, probably when he was in summer youth camp and he saw something or felt something or heard something, or his best friends telling him about the garbage cans lids when they were playing with the Ouija boards. It's like when you truly believe there's this spiritual warfare and miracles and stuff, then this is the driving force, not 2,000-year-old texts.
It does. One other
Laura,
quick thing.
Go ahead.
And that is, you're married, I'm married, Cameron's married.
Yep.
Have you read the book, The 5 Love Languages?
Long time ago.
Okay.
I've heard about it.
Thanks, Scott
Okay,
Duke.
great book. Read it.
Appreciate it.
It saved my marriage. And years ago, it saved my marriage. Just a great book. And it talks about how there's like 5 major different love languages, and we all have a primary one in which we like to be loved. And a lot of times your spouse is speaking a love language.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward
So
this.
I'm actually scrolling down here to find the.
This is his inner circle
Let's
set.
get to the questions.
And that's all we have. And I think it's okay for us to be honest about that. I think sometimes we foreground this stuff is this sort of. I just don't think it's good enough. So I think that's okay for us to be honest about this. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of my take on that. But
All right. Well, we've got a lot of questions that have popped up, and I'm sure that it'll give us an opportunity to have some more back and forth. So this one is just a very nice comment from Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you for your super chat. He says, "I love you both, Mike and Laura. God bless."
Thanks.
So are you
That's called $2 advertising.
familiar with him? He's got a YouTube channel, I think, pretty popular, and he's done some work with Michael Heiser and some other scholars. He's got a really cool podcast.
Michael Heiser, by the way, who believes that there's probably hundreds, thousands, millions, maybe even billions of gods that exist that are not demons or angels. You should check Michael Heiser out.
Or YouTube channel, rather.
Hey, thank you, Susan Gibbard, for the donation.
So I'm actually scrolling down here to find the next super chat, and I've got it's from Paulogia.
Oh.
I always pronounce it wrong.
It's Paulogia.
He says, what is the, and you probably are familiar with him, yeah, and his wife, or girlfriend?
Girlfriend, I think, yeah.
Well, what is the source? His question is, what is the source for Polycarp or Clement being disciples of Jesus' disciples? Do they say so themselves? Probably a question for Mike.
Well, Polycarp doesn't say it, neither does Clement in either of their letters, okay? But you would have some later church fathers who would say it. I believe Irenaeus says it, and there are...
Why is Paul asking this question? What is the source for Polycarp or Clement being disciples of Jesus' disciples? Because earlier on, I think when he goes, I saw those slides that Mike probably mentioned this as a source of why he believes this.
Are a number of different, I just don't know them right off. I do have it in my book, my large book on Jesus' resurrection, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. I think it's chapter 3 where I assess various sources. And
Great question for Paulogia. It basically forcing Mike to admit that he really doesn't know.
I mean, I do know some people who argue that the Polycarp letter is pseudographical, but that's I don't have a lot to add to that, and that's something people thought about. So it's also always hard when yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just gonna say we were talking about this before we went live. It's this setup, this scene here has the halo behind you, perfect. It's like the little cross it looks like a what? All right, anyways, let's move on. So from Sigfredo, I'm so bad with names. Here it is. Here's this question. Thank you for your super chat. In the accounts of religions from Buddhism to Shinto, symbolic figures utilize miracles. History honestly.
Drawer and Apollonius of Tyana and several others, but these are usually more than
I can tell. I'm not interested in this question. Let's find a good question here.
Frustrated with people love to send me stuff they find on the internet and just have me fact check it for them, which is it's very demoralizing after a while. And I think the thing that I was getting increasingly frustrated by, especially because after a while people would start coming to me, is it seemed like it was getting very, and this is something that I noticed. So I grew up in sort of the I graduated from high school in 2007, so I mean apologetics was a huge part of my high school experience and the way that we talked about.
By the way, in case you can't read this, someone quoted Laura saying, the goal of lay-level apologetics is to feel personally vindicated and humiliate others. end quote, Laura Rumson. I love that quote, although I don't think apologist has ever humiliated me. But I do think, especially the 18 to 22-year-old guys who are Christians who use apologetics, they need vindication. They so desperately want this to be viewed and respected as having, I have solid reasons to believe this is true, and I have great historical evidence to believe this is true, and I am smart, I am educated, and please don't dare think I'm stupid for believing this.
About getting ready for college. And I was constantly under the impression that what we were training to do, and I think you see this in things like the God's Not Dead movies and in a lot of, the way that these things get thrown out there, that the idea is that you're training to go out there and beat somebody, right? That you are going to be facing the world, which is made up of these opponents who want to talk you out of something, and it is your job, not necessarily to convert them. Like, that's often not really the goal. It certainly isn't in some of the, in the discourse I've seen online. There's not, but the goal is to beat them, right? And this is just so opposed to the way that I think the Academy works at its best when you have people who can be very vehement. There's nothing wrong with being really into a subject and being really animated and excited and aggressive about it. Lord knows that's kind of my thing because I am naturally a very loud person. But I think you can get this tendency where it's a lot more about this, Thunderdome approach to historical knowledge, and I just don't think that's the purpose of this stuff. So I think you can get really
it's about being right, feeling right, having people respect you. It's like, I don't want to be seen as stupid and dumb.
Ugly really quickly. And I think there aren't enough people who are leading these conversations that are interested in stopping that. So that's just a concern I have.
Would you say that you were being a little hyperbolic there?
Oh, no,
No.
I mean...
Don't give in.
When you say the goal of lay-level apologetics.
I'm trying really hard not to name names. I think there are definitely some people who that's the goal. I think there are definitely people who that's the goal. And they have very big audiences because this is satisfying for them. So, yeah.
Presuppositionalists will often say that the goal is to shut the mouths of the unbeliever.
Do you get that? Yeah. I mean, I suspect you don't get that impression from Mike.
No, it's really no. And I worked for Pete Williams for a summer when I was in grad school. I think he's a great guy. I know lots of wonderful people who do this. And Bart Ehrman is one of my teachers, and he's on more on the counter side. But these are debates he does, and he's a wonderful teacher. I think he's a terrific person to have in the Academy. No, this is not. It's okay. Hyperbolic in scale of the problem. It's not everybody, but the people who do practice this, who do have this more Thunderdome approach to scholarship, I think it's really destructive. So yeah.
All right, we have another question along.
So the bottom line is, Christian apologists, you need more love, and be willing to lose. Be willing to be humiliated by guys like me. Be willing to be trapped by guys like me. Be willing to look silly and stupid by guys like me, because what does it matter? You are right. You are on the side of God. You are his child. You have eternal life. I'm lost. Life is just a vapor. So who cares if you lose debates? Who cares if you look stupid? It's all for the glory of God, right?
The same lines. It says from Aiden Peterson. He says, "Hey guys, Laura, who are the apologists, quote unquote apologists, you have in mind when you claim that they think history can deal in certainty? Could you give some names?"
I can't remember what this is referring to.
I can give names to this question. Side 10 Brugenkate, Red Grace Media, Revealed Apologetics. Basically, I'm naming all the Reformed Calvinists. Reformed Calvinists will say that they can do history. Well, hang on. They're apologists. Yeah. And that basically the history found within the text of the Bible, anything that claims to be historical is in fact historical, but not because of the historical method.
A lot of this is also just reflecting on my days as as somebody who was really interested in apologetics when I was in high school and college, where I think that a lot of what was happening is that the goal was to give us something to put our faith in.
I knew you would like that, Alexio.
That could be really that could be really rock solid, and also that nobody would ever be able to challenge and nobody would ever be able to take away. And I think that's just not something that can actually happen when you have when you're talking.
By the way, tip for the Christian apologists watching who do debates. Here's a little tip from PineCreek. Purposely at the beginning of the debate, admit defeat and say, but let's still try to have a great conversation here. Let's have a civil dialogue. But just come out the gate saying, you know what, I think my opponent's actually better read on this topic, probably has more papers and more prep than I did. They're probably going to be right on a lot of things. We're not going to agree on things. But as far as the debate goes, I think I've lost this even before it starts. I tell you, you start a debate like that, you're going to have 51% of the people, actually probably more than that, on your side from the get-go. Because you're saying, look, I'm defeated already. There's nothing for me to gain here other than just having a civil conversation.
Talking about tentative conclusions, which is at best what history can give us. So, I'm not, again, I'm really trying to not turn this into a call-out session, but I think there are a lot of curriculums and shows that do sort of promise this. And again, I'm not always schooled in who the stars are right now. A lot of this is based on at least this.
Do you think that's bad?
I think it's not realistic. I think it's just not a big part of what being a Christian is. I think it's just, a lot of Christianity is about doubt, and not doubt, but I think a lot of Christianity is about ambiguity and not necessarily knowing where God is when X happens. I think that's a big part of it. So, and I think we need to be honest that is a lot of people's experience of Christianity, and it would be really nice if we could package a form of Christianity that didn't include the unpleasant bits, but that's just not how it works.
I don't see Strobel as doing that in his book. I mean, he is dealing with.
Let me just reference what we're talking about here, because we're talking about. You said that apologists deal in certainty, and so that's what we're talking about when it comes to Strobel's books and his work.
I honestly don't think Strobel would be a good example of apologists who deal with certainty. I think the presuppositionalists are the ones you target there, but I think even Lee Strobel would say you can get pretty darn close, 99.9%.
And everything.
Yeah, I mean, I know Lee personally. He's a real humble guy, actually, which if I'd sold as many copies of my books as he has, I'd have a head that couldn't fit, on the screen. He's an amazingly humble guy. But the background he's coming from was.
No, Iron Charioteer, I cannot ask questions because I'm blocked. I don't know why I'm blocked. I'm blocked from Capturing Christianity's page.
An atheist legal journalist for the Chicago Tribune. So as a legal journalist trained at Yale, a master's degree in legal journalism.
This bothers me. Okay, for Christians listening, I'm telling you up front, this sort of thing, what Mike Licona is doing now, really gets my gitch in a knot. It's this whole idea is, well, Lee Strobel was a reporter and he went to Yale and therefore what? It's like, there are medical doctors, there's probably even surgeons who are Scientologists in California. There's probably lawyers who went to Yale who are living in Salt Lake City, Utah, who are Mormons. I tell you, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you can believe the stupidest things in certain areas of your life, especially, I think, when it comes to what gives you hope, meaning, and purpose, and in fear of eternal damnation and that sort of thing.
At Yale, he is approaching this as through law, and he's not trying to prove it beyond all doubt. I mean, he's still got things in mind like reasonable doubt, or that would be in a criminal case. But of course, in a civil case, you're looking preponderance of evidence, and it was the preponderance of evidence that did convince him. And he just made a case for why he.
And yet, it wouldn't convince them that the flying man is real. If I layer in that evidence line by line,
thinks the evidence suggests that Christianity is true.
And his wife became a Christian before him, brought him to church. He was a drunk and he was desperate. Desperation leads to change of lifestyle, life decisions. And I honestly believe, I'm not even you don't have to be that much of a psychologist to see that that's what happened.
Or you've made a case on why you think we shouldn't make a case for Christianity being true. So, I mean, we're all making cases. It's just, I think we're wired differently. Strobel was wired that way. He needed evidence because he was an atheist. His marriage was blowing up because his wife had become a Christian when she had been an atheist. She became a Christian not based on any evidence.
Yeah. Oh, this is so gorgeous. This is so scrumptious. It's like, it doesn't matter. Evidence? Yeah, Lee Strobel became Christian. No evidence? His wife became a Christian. It's like evidence doesn't matter. It's like you can become a Christian with it or without it. And, if Christians think I'm straw manning guys like Lee Strobel, I just said the reason why I think Lee Strobel became a Christian. And then you hear Mike Licona basically saying the exact words I said. He didn't say that's why he became a Christian, but it's almost like he became a Christian first and then sought out the evidence so he didn't feel stupid about it or bad about it, so he could justify it in his mind. What's the saying, the quote, beliefs come first, reasons come second?
But he wanted to disprove it. He wanted to check it out and see if it were true. And so he did do a journey. It wasn't like exactly in the Case for Christ. He admits that was kind of...
okay, we don't need to know more about that.
None of the circles that I run in tout that view. Anyways, let's move on. We've got another question from Paul. He says, what is preventing the gospel group appearances reports from being legendary?
Ooh.
Well, we can't necessarily verify any of them, but I would say we do seem like from Paul's testimony in 1 Corinthians 15, from that oral tradition that probably goes back to the apostles, that there were 3 group appearances at least that are mentioned, to the 12, to more than 500, to all the apostles. And you do have some that are multiply attested.
See, this is a great question by Paul, because he's basically asking, what is the foundation for what Paul said here? What is the meat behind it? Is there any evidence to show that what Paul is saying about group appearances is actually true? And I think what Mike Licona is admitting here is, no, there isn't any other evidence. We just have to trust what Paul said is true. It's a creed. It's written out nicely, and it sounds like, okay, if that's a creed, and if Paul became a Christian later, like a few years later, then that dates back to maybe then. But it could be very well the case that there were no group appearances, and then over time, over 3 years, or even 20 years when 1 Corinthians was written later, that grew into, oh, you experienced Jesus too? Yeah, I did too. You saw, and it went from experienced Jesus or seeing Jesus in visions to just that feeling of charismatic type feeling, and it grew. And oh, wow, we're up to 500 people now who believe in Christianity, and Jesus appeared to all of them, but not in the way I'm appearing to you guys right now.
Think so. I mean, again, I'm going to just part with Laura on and say you've got some independence of John from the synoptics, and you've got group of...
You know what's interesting? The most independent source we have among the Gospels is the one that's the furthest dated away from the purported event, near the 100 AD. Isn't that interesting?
Appearances, like you've got the appearance to the one where the first group appearance that's mentioned, Judas was absent. Now, I think that this is the first group appearance that is mentioned by Luke in Luke 24.
So everything that Mike Licona is saying right now, all those people that could have seen Jesus, it's reporting group experiences, but all those people would probably be dead by the time those Gospels were written, if you take the consensus dating, and if you believe that most people didn't live past 50, which is a very safe assumption, even accounting for child death mortality. So Paul's question is great. There is nothing supporting what Paul said there about group appearances, other than what's written way later than Paul.
Occurs in Jerusalem. And I'm also very convinced, as I argue for in my book on gospel differences, that the appearance to the disciples in Galilee in Matthew, I think that's the same appearance that Luke is reporting and that John is reporting that happened in Jerusalem. Why Matthew has it in Galilee, I have no idea. Yeah. So I do think there's some.
I want to hear what
by
Laura says.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't know if I want to call it a multiple attestation of the Matthew 28, the appearance at the mountain in Galilee, versus being in the upper room in Luke. Those actually seem like pretty radically different stories to me, and especially because the purpose of the stories is,
By the way, I want to go on record as saying that this was a bad idea for Cameron Bertuzzi to do, to have Laura Robinson up against Mike Licona, because if you love Laura and you don't like Mike so much, or vice versa, it doesn't look good for Christianity when two Christians who love Jesus desperately, I really do believe they both love Jesus, the idea of Jesus in my mind, both historians, well, at least Laura's a graduate student in history, and the way they view the evidence, Mike views it as sufficient, Laura doesn't. You cannot say at this point that Laura has a predisposition against miracles, because she doesn't. She would tell you, she'd be the first one to tell you that she experiences a miracle every time she takes part in communion, the Eucharist. She's told me that. So all this stuff that atheists hear from Christians about, oh, you just don't believe this because you have this presupposition, you're just this naturalistic minded stuff, you're not open to it. No, there are many Christians who are like Laura and say, no, you cannot get there by reading these texts. Not even close to being sufficient for the claim. Bad idea to have these two together representing Christianity. Can you imagine those doubting Christians right now who are kind of like on the edge? They can kind of see the naturalistic or the atheist point or whatever, the criticisms against Christianity, and they're listening to this. Not everybody's like Laura. Like when they see that, okay, that if they come to believe that the evidence is truly not sufficient for their belief, I would dare say most of them are not going to end up like Laura and become some type of progressive Christian. No, they're just going to leave. Why do I say this? Like you look at the studies, I'm thinking of Mormonism especially. When Mormons come out of Mormonism, they don't become just your general Christian evangelicals. They leave it. They become agnostic or atheist or whatever. Hey, thank you, Edward Art, for the donation. Who else thinks Doug is looking mad cute today? Whoa. You know why? This is the truth. The reason why I'm looking so cute today is because I had my pupils dilated. I was at the eye doctor.
Is very dissimilar. I mean, you have the commissioning in both, but it seems a lot more about assuring the disciples to not be afraid in Luke. So I guess I'm just not so sure that, here's the thing. I think whenever you're talking about stories that have one version of them that is written down, that you have one accounting to it, kind of the least interesting thing we can ask about it is, did it happen or not? Because there's just not a lot to go on. There's just not a lot to weigh. So when you're talking about the Great Commission in Matthew, I actually think that...
Okay, let's fast forward.
...of Israel is...
I'm getting a little bored.
Again, I'm not going to get into a lot of it here, of course, but I do deal with it in my book on gospel differences.
Let's get to another question.
Joy and amazement. They were unbelieving, apistos, no belief. Yet they felt joy and amazement. They were apistos, unbelieving. I think that these terms are being used. Luke is just using a stronger term than Matthew. It's like, look, both my parents are dead, but if they showed up at the door, I mean, I buried them both. I know they're dead, but if they showed up at the door and I'm hugging them and smelling them, it's like, yeah, I mean, I can't prove that it's not legend, but it's not.
Okay, so let's see the question. I didn't see the question.
I don't know what does prevent it, but I think there's a lot, that we can historically prove the resurrection. I think for one thing, I think that methodological naturalism is a bit underrated for history.
Oh, okay. What is missing historically for you, Laura, from Joshua Leclerc? That's a pretty good question. What would you need to see historically?
Historical research. I think that this is, I think it takes a lot of heat because of the way in which it gets lumped in with ontological naturalism, which I don't think it has to be at all. I think it's a very useful tool for doing things. But again, if we're just talking about saying that we found a good historical record for this completely anomalous event where a person was definitely dead and then they definitely weren't, more than one witness, honestly, more than one textual witness has survived. I think that would be really useful. More than one firsthand account.
And Christians like Michael Licona are screaming right now, we do have that, Laura. We do have more than one witness. What Laura is saying, to understand Laura, you have to understand that when she means witness, she's talking about a real eyewitness that we view as a witness today. You would never say picking up a piece of paper off the street with writing on it that's not dated, that has no name on it, not signed, claiming someone committed a murder. You wouldn't take that seriously. You might find it interesting. It might cause you to look into other things, but you would not see that as good evidence or an eyewitness account, because it's not an eyewitness account. It's an anonymous account. Could even be a hearsay account. Don't lower your standards just for Jesus. I say that all the time.
Ideally, lots of them. I mean, it almost never happens that we get a bunch of witnesses for something in history, but when we're talking about that long ago. But no, I mean, I'd be willing to talk about a pterodactyl flying over London 500 years ago if 500 people all independently wrote about it. It seems insane, but anomalous. But I'd be willing to hear about it. And talk.
Camille Gregor, I don't know if he's still here, but he had a great. If all you had was the historical method and you had this amazing claim, extraordinary claim, ooh, that triggers some people, like Jesus rose from the dead. Have an encapsulated, preserved gospel that is right in line with the New Testament, that's dug up, that could somehow be radioactive dated to the first century, that's preserved, but it's found in Central America. Before there was the inventions of ships to go from the Palestine area to Central America. Now that would be something, would it not? Like, even you hyper-skeptical atheists out there listening, if you could radiocarbon date this to the first century, and it says basically the same things the Gospels say, and it's preserved in some, like, I don't know, volcanic something, you got to take a second look at that.
Talk about it. So maybe if we had more of those 500 people who saw Jesus,
Shannon.
I think that'd be worth talking about. So, yeah.
You do think that Paul believed it, right?
Oh, no, there's no doubt. Yeah,
So you go with Paul, but
yeah.
I hear you saying one source. Now, that might be one written source we have, but would you agree that this is also what the Jerusalem apostles are teaching?
Well, I mean, they what they say about hearsay in court, but
I thought you didn't like court, like
I'm
the case for
playing.
Christ. You don't like court.
Yeah.
See, what Mike's trying to do is like exactly what I just said, that when Christians are going to scream when they hear Laura talk, that we have more than one eyewitness account. Laura, what are you talking about? You're nuts. And Michael Licona is kind of thinking the same thing. Is, well, don't you think we have accounts from the early Jerusalem apostles? Peter, for example? Haven't you read 1 Peter? And Laura's saying, no, I don't believe Peter wrote 1 Peter, or I don't think, the gospel's saying that so-and-so many people saw this happen. That's not an eyewitness account. It does not count. And so even if you're a Christian who thinks it does count as an eyewitness account or testimony, please know that I would dare say the majority of humanity, thinking humanity, would disagree with you here for the reasons I said earlier. And I think you even disagree with yourself as a Christian when it comes to eyewitness claims today. But for some reason, you put it 2,000 years ago, then it becomes an eyewitness account.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm like, but no, I think when we're talking about the, I definitely think, the Jerusalem apostles were teaching the resurrection. It looks like this is a belief that becomes very normative very quickly. But again, like the doctrine of the resurrection, the concept of the resurrection, I think that is a little bit, that's at least a little bit distinct from saying that, Jesus was definitely dead and then he definitely wasn't.
But they're at least saying, you admit that they were saying, they believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you believe that they believed Jesus rose and had appeared to them?
Yeah, it sounds like they definitely believe that Jesus had appeared to them. It sounds like they definitely believe that.
So even if we just had Paul, you would still think the evidence is sufficient to conclude that even the Jerusalem apostles, at least Peter, James, and John, as well as Paul, all believed that Jesus rose and had appeared to them.
Yes, I think if we're going to...
Yes, I'm going to predict what she's going to say. Yes, but we don't know what appeared means. And again, the Pentecostal church is a prime example of that, where Christians today will say Jesus appeared to them, but that doesn't mean appeared to them in bodily form like you're seeing me right now, or except in 3D instead of 2D.
Talk about a historical resurrection, though, that is very different from saying, a historical vision, right? It kind of looks like that's about as far as we can get with that. We're saying that the Jerusalem disciples were very sure that Jesus appeared to them. We don't really know what form that took because we don't have their account of it. So I think
exactly. We don't riddle me this. What color was Jesus's hair, Christians? If we have all these eyewitness accounts, what color was Jesus' hair? What color was his eyes? How tall was Jesus roughly? You realize we don't have accounts, multiple independent accounts of what Jesus looked like. So when it says in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appeared to 500, if we were to ask those 500, what did Jesus look like? Do you think we would get something close? If you would think we should. If it was indeed a bodily appearance to 500 people, we'd probably say, "Oh yeah, Jesus was 5'2". He looked like Mario from Nintendo, short guy, red hat."
It would be one thing to have more than one, to talk about Jesus.
You think John is independent of Paul, right?
Sorry?
You think John is independent of Paul?
I think I think John is probably dependent on the Synoptic Gospels.
But
Laura does not believe John's independent of Paul. Laura believes that John took from the Synoptics, and the Synoptics, mainly Mark, took from Paul, and where Paul got his stuff was probably, through that oral tradition.
Completely dependent?
On the Synoptic Gospels, I think John is using Synoptic Gospels. I think that's
well, at least one of the traditions. I don't agree with that, but at least one of the traditions in the Synoptic Gospels would be independent of Paul, right? Or do you think it's all coming from Paul?
Well, Paul is definitely the big voice of early Christianity, isn't he? If we think that Mark is working from Paul's scholarship, I think basically the entire New Testament is responding to Paul's theology in some way. I don't think that's quite the same thing as saying that.
If what Laura's saying is true, and I agree with her, basically you only have one source for Jesus' life and ministry, and that's Paul. You don't have this multiple attestation thing going on, at least not fully.
Everyone is just dependent on Paul for all this. Because I don't want this to get overstated. My point is not that Paul personally is the only guy with a resurrection account, and then all reports come from that. I don't think that's the case. But it's different to say that a lot of these early people in these Christians in early churches were having these experiences of Jesus appearing to them. That's very different from saying that Jesus was definitely alive again. I think that's a really different claim. And it might sound like splitting hairs, but I actually think when we're talking about something as significant as a person was dead and then he wasn't, this is the kind of thing you really need. So, I
agree with you. It is a different thing. No question about that. Where we disagree is I think we can go further and ask the question.
I can tell that it's over, right? Because now they're at 85 people watching, and I'm over 300.
What led them?
If someone can get Laura in here, I'd be willing to have her on and see what her thoughts are.
To that belief, what was the nature of those experiences? What led the early disciples to have that belief that Jesus had risen and had appeared to them? And then we can take the known data and then weigh competing hypotheses to see which one best explains. That's where I would go further than you on this.
Sure, but we almost never know what causes visionary experiences in history, and that's just not really something that historians can recover. We don't know what caused the Salem witch trials, for instance. There has been a modernist push to blame it on, wheat algae, but that's not quite it. There has been a push to blame, we don't know what caused Hildegard's visions. People have said that it was caused by migraines, but that's not something we necessarily know.
We do know what causes visions, at least in some cases, and that is trauma. It's desperation. It's sleep deprivation. It's the loss of a loved one. And so it is very reasonable. What's the stats on that? It's way higher than you would think. I think it's like 22% of, maybe it's not that high. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's close to double digits at least. People will experience in multiple ways their dead loved ones whom they love, their spouses and so forth. And Jesus was a spouse to the disciples. And so it makes perfect sense that one or two of them could have had visions of Jesus coming back. And that led to to other people saying, oh yeah, I saw him too. And then before you know it, we got a movement going on and a legend developing that there was group appearances, but it wasn't like fleshy. And then the Gospels borrowed from Paul, and John borrowed from synoptics, and they basically historicized a lot of it. But whether that happened or not, I don't know, but it makes a lot of sense, and it seems a lot more probable, and history is about probabilities, than a man actually rising from the dead. And as Laura's pointing out here, you do not have to be a dirty atheist like me. You can say stuff like that and not have presuppositions against miracles.
I think there's a lot of different things that could be behind these things, but oftentimes we just don't know what caused visions.
True, we would just question the cause. We wouldn't question the fact that the person had visions or that the Salem witch trials actually occurred.
Right, of course. But also, right. But I think the analogy here is no one is questioning that the early church happened. No one is questioning that the early church had this, mission and calling and purpose. No one is denying that that's what happened. The question is, can this only be explained by Jesus having actually definitely come back from the dead? I think there's lots of other things that could explain it. I think Jesus came back from the dead, but I don't think that's something that we necessarily arrive at from history.
Give some examples, Laura, of what else could have happened. By the way, I just emailed Laura, so we'll see if she gets it. But I got a problem. I got to pee soon. So if she does want to come on, I'll stop this and start a new live stream.
I agree with you that there are various explanations that can be offered for it. But that's where the task of the historian is to weigh those hypotheses critically using criteria such as explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, to see which hypothesis best explains the data. And when we do, we find that there is a huge disparity in the ability of the hypotheses to account for those data. Resurrection wins by a huge margin.
Well, how would we test that, though? This is something I want to know. Is because, it's not like we know what resurrections cause. We have no analogous experience of somebody being resurrected and saying, oh, yeah, well, the people who saw this resurrected person, definitely then this happened to them. So this must have been the effect that the resurrection had on them. So I think that I think that that's a little bit of an overstatement, because we just don't know how most people would be affected by the sight of seeing a revivified person. I'm just not sure that that's clear. So
remember, I'm not saying that as a historian we can show that God raised Jesus. I'm fine with saying Jesus was raised and leave the cause undetermined. But I do think the resurrection hypothesis explains the data far better than anything else like hallucinations, metaphor.
No, it does not. It does not. It doesn't even come close. And the reason why there's a difference between Laura and Mike Licona here is because Mike is coming from a perspective that most of the stuff that he reads, not all of it, but most of the stuff he reads is basically reliable and true and historical to begin with. Whereas I'm not so sure on the spectrum, Laura's probably less so that way. And there's a lot of apologists and historians who are more so that way compared to even Mike. It's like a spectrum of what you think actually happened. And so it's fixed, it's lodged in Mike's mind that these people truly, sincerely believe that Jesus appeared to them in the flesh. And since Paul said it, and since he believes that the other accounts in the Gospels are reliable, we have multiple attestations, so it's a done deal.
Stolen body, anything like that, disciples lied.
Yeah, I just don't know how we would test that. I think that's kind of the question is, what possible analogy would we have to the idea that the only thing that could have possibly explained this is a revivified person? We don't always know what causes movements that seem to grow very quickly. Like with Joseph Smith, it seems like Joseph Smith was able to amass a lot of followers very quickly. And from my perspective, it certainly seems like the golden...
But Joseph Smith was a con man, Laura. You know that. The evidence is so far superior for Mormonism as it is compared to Christianity. This is why we can denounce it so quickly, because the evidence is so superior. With Christianity, it's like 2,000 years ago, and it's so hard to... I tell you, what if it were true? Paul went to the whorehouse once in a while. Like, can you imagine if that was true? Like, if that was written down, like, would Christianity still be going as strong as it is today?
Tablets would be a much stronger explanatory power for how he was able to convince so many people so quickly than not having golden tablets, right? And that's but that's not something we think, right? Like sometimes things happen in history that we're not necessarily sure of. So
this is why I think the whole conversation.
It's just a matter of which one best explains the data. We don't have to prove it beyond all doubt. It's which one best explains it.
You talk to Orthodox Jews, and some of them, I'm thinking of Tovia Singer. I'm not sure if he actually has come out and used the word con man, but it's pretty close. I think guys, Orthodox Jews like Tovia Singer, view the Apostle Paul the same way Christians view Joseph Smith, as a wretched con artist who took the sacred scriptures found in the Torah and just bastardized them, just like Joseph Smith bastardized the true gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the same thing.
The data. So there can be various explanations, but this is the best explanation.
That's why I was saying earlier that I think this whole the majority of the disagreement is mainly about methodology, because Laura's like, how can we test that? And I think what Mike is saying is he has these criteria of like what a good explanation is. And he mentioned a couple of them. And then he says, well, we then look at we get our pool of explanations, and then we start to apply the criteria through the explanations. And then whichever one comes out the best, we label the best explanation. So here's my question, Mike. How do we know that the best explanation is the real explanation?
Well, we can't get to what we have to do.
That's a good question. You don't.
We look. And okay, so when I'm weighing hypotheses, okay.
Sometimes the best explanation actually could be the wrong one. And I'm trying to think of an example in science. Well, you can go with theories of relativity, maybe. Knowledge is provisional. Like we learn things all the time. And so at a certain moment in history, a certain moment in time, we might have the best explanation for something that we see, but that could change. In fact, I think Mike Licona even admitted that earlier in this live stream, or when Laura said this, that we don't know what will be unearthed next week in the Palestine area. And there could be something unearthed that would just potentially destroy Christianity, Mike Licona's version of Christianity. And it would be done. That'd be it for him. So right now, Michael Licona could say the resurrection is the best explanation. 2 weeks from now, he might not.
I look at, let's say, the hallucination hypothesis, and I say, all right, what's the data that's virtually indisputable? All right, Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly thereafter, a number of
this a million times.
We expect the very kinds of things that we get.
These things after the fact, they interpret strange and confusing, bizarre experiences through their own present experience and through what's available to them. So the fact that Paul is narrating this stuff, he's having other forces in his life shaping how he narrates this besides just this vision. I actually don't know if we know for a fact that this thing that he saw or the person he saw was exactly the same thing as what Peter, James, and John saw.
Great point. This is my point when trying to describe, like, if there were sketch artists in the first century talking to those 500 witnesses, talking to Paul, talking to the disciples, apostles, whatever. Sketch artist. Okay. Describe Jesus. Did they all see the same thing after he rose from the dead?
We just have this narration after the fact that they all kind of came to agree with each other. And also, I think when you get to this final bit here that, the most important thing is that, once we assume that there is a resurrecting God involved, and once we believe that there is a God who loves us and who loves Jesus involved, then of course this becomes a lot more plausible. Amen. Hallelujah. That's great. It's just not history, right? Like this has been more of this. This is a theological presupposition we're making. But I think that for the most part, this isn't. We're privileging a Christian cosmology there because it's our assumption. But this isn't really something we do for other faiths when we're talking as theologians. I mean, not as theologians, as sociologists or historians. Like we can go down to Mexico right now and find people who are practicing Santeria and who say that they have cured all kinds of gynecological.
What is Laura doing right now? Outsider test for faith. Oh, Anthony Magnabosco would be so proud.
Ailments or eye problems, and we could find lots of people who would attest to the fact that they have been helped by these Santeria practitioners. And I think we would all agree that as Christians we would not say, well, then the most likely thing is that they were invoking this spirit that is particular to this one area.
Oh, you're wrong, Laura. You're wrong. They would say the most likely thing is that there's a real spirit, and the spirit's a demon This is how they get out of this outsider test for faith for spiritual experiences. They say, "Oh, it was real. Yeah, it was real. It's just it wasn't from God. It wasn't from Jesus. It wasn't from the Holy Spirit. It was from a demon." That's the get out of jail free card.
Who was active in the herb, and this must have been what happened because this is the context in which we would expect a Santeria-oriented miracle to happen. That's the kind of thing that a person who presupposes that religion says. So I think if we're talking about this a little bit if we're trying to be, equal opportunity worldview entertainers here, it's
you never say that, Laura, especially to some Christians. It's not equal. There's people who walk in the light and there's people who walk in the darkness. There's no such thing as neutrality. We come to the evidence with our presuppositions of what is likely to happen and what's not. And no, you can't come from a neutral perspective. If you're a Christian, you should know that, Laura. I'm speaking on the behalf of some Christians. You're welcome.
Really hard to get to something like a resurrection if we don't have an agent who would do it. So that I think that's a bit of a concern. So yeah.
Do you mind if we leave it there and then we move on to more questions?
Sorry. Yeah.
No worries. All right. So I know that, Mike, you've got
clear. I didn't say that we should assume God exists and wanted to raise Jesus.
Oh, super chat from Camille Gregor, my boy. Is the master's thesis surveying scholarship on Peter being a source behind the Gospel of Mark publicly available? Oh, yes. Okay.
I said that would need to be done. We'd have to show it if we wanted to show plausibility. I think the plausibility is actually inscrutable.
Yeah.
All right. So we have some more questions. Do you guys have any more time to stick around, or do we need to cut it short? Or not short, but do we need to? You guys,
I can take a few more
have
minutes.
a couple more?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for Mike. Yeah.
I'd take 5 more minutes.
Okay.
So, why is Camille Gregor asking this question? He's asking this question because earlier in the live stream, Mike Licona said that there is a survey of a slight majority of scholarship that says that the source for Mark's gospel is Peter. And so Camille is saying, can I see that thesis?
This sounds good.
5 more minutes. Okay. We'll get through as many as we can. So a lightning round. All right. Camille Gregor says, is the master's thesis surveying scholarship on Peter being a source behind Mark publicly available?
Oh, that's a great question.
Unfortunately, it is not. He just finished it. I've encouraged him to continue with it in his doctoral research, which he hopes to do. And I think it's 207 sources of critical.
You know what this reminds me of? I'm getting a little too excited here. This reminds me of first century Mark debacle. It's like, we have this first century fragment, and then it turns out to be, sorry, it's not available yet, but it should be on the shelves soon.
Scholars, but they're all English, so he wants to check out in his doctoral work what French, German, and some other sources, scholars in those other languages are saying. But
so once he checks out the French and the German and maybe the Slovakians and the Libyans and the Chinese and the Peruvians and the Chileans, once he surveys all those other scholars, then maybe that 51% will drop a little bit to, I don't know, 20%. We'll see.
I think 207 critical scholars since 1965 is a pretty good sampling. I'm going to.
Camille Gregor's in the live stream chat right now saying, this is such bullshit.
Try to interview him at some point, so you can be on the lookout in my YouTube channel to see if that comes out. But no, it's not published yet.
Name of your YouTube channel for people that want to go subscribe?
Just go to.
We should place bets. Because remember, Mike Licona is quoted as saying that it's a slight majority earlier. I'm not 100% sure on that. Place your bets if that number is going to drop. And if it does drop, will this ever be published? If it goes up, I guarantee you it will be published. But if it goes down, will it be published? In other words, if Mike Licona, if you ever listen to this, make sure that this person publishes it no matter what the results are.
Just go to Mike Licona and then come up with the channel.
Yeah, that's important. All right. Question from Ronald Mendonca. He says, thank you for your super chat.
Ronald Mendonca, I know you. Why didn't Jesus make sure there were reporters there at the time? He's God, right? That's a great question. And why not use a miracle to have smartphones with an infinite battery life that could have documented and filmed everything?
Ronald, why didn't Jesus make sure that there were reporters there at the time? He's God, right?
Why does God do anything?
That's right.
Because he's free to do what he wants. He's God.
You know, they're laughing, but this is actually a brilliant question. Like, if you're a Christian who actually desires sufficient evidence to believe something, doesn't this help get you to sufficient? Wouldn't it have helped if reporters for Pilate would have been there to actually interview Jesus after he rose from the dead? And said, so, okay, what happened, Jesus? Well, I was in the tomb, you see, and it was a little dark in there, you see, and then it was just on the third day, you see, God rose me. I'm God, but he rose me. And you see, there's an angel rolled a stone away, but I left before the stone was. No, I left. I left before the stone was rolled away, and then I can't divulge where I went after that. But I saw a whole bunch of other people. Well, what order did you see them, Jesus? Who did you see first? Well, it depends what gospel you read. You see.
All right, let's get to another question here, from Biss W. This is amazing. Top speakers, please get Nathaniel Jensen, AIG Ken Ham, and Josh Swamidas to discuss human evolution. Jensen is doing
firm in your mind. It's like a speech act. You're also doing, you're following. It's like when Jesus says to believe in him, he's not just saying believe that, pray a prayer. When the rich man came to him and Jesus said, yeah, you lack one thing, just sell all you have, give to the poor, come follow me. And the guy walked away grieving because he had a lot. Jesus didn't say, oh, okay, no, wait a minute, just come on down, kneel before me, pray this prayer, and at least get heaven settled for you. And discipleship's a process. No, he let the guy walk. He's looking for followers, not just people who will ascend.
Yeah, know what Jesus didn't say. He didn't say, oh, it's by faith alone and not, and it's through grace that you're saved, not by any works of your own, other than go sell your possessions and give to the poor.
To certain beliefs.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, there's a classic objective-subjective debate in Greek about whether or not the.
All right. This will be, I think, the last question for us today. 20 Faces. How would you describe, or how would you prove to a non-Christian that the resurrection occurred without focusing on historical evidence? And how do you come to have all this information of Jesus without studying history?
Oh, that is a great question. I'm sure it was meant for Laura, because Laura believes that she has experienced Jesus today, and she doesn't need this 2,000-year-old stuff to believe in Jesus. Oh, hang on. I got an email from Laura, I think. She emailed me and said, no. I actually think she doesn't like me much anymore, because she loved me in the first 2 interviews, but she didn't like me in the third one when I interviewed her husband. And then when I put a short video out, ever since then, things haven't been the same. But anyhow, this is a great question to Laura. How would you prove to a non-Christian that the resurrection occurred without focusing on the historical evidence? And how do you come to have all this information of Jesus without studying history? So Laura's thing is like, there's a lot of this we just don't know. There's so much uncertainty using the historical method. And yet she has this personal relationship based on.
That's like a question for you, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Paul, the vast majority of what Paul is talking about is not always history. It's the implications of the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? And that is something that is known outside of history. Paul thinks that Jesus died once for all and that he was raised never to die again. This is his conception of resurrection. So I think that all of this means that Jesus is the Jesus that Paul interacted with in his own lifetime is the same Jesus people are interacting with now. So I think that you can look back at the history of the way in which people have interacted with Jesus throughout history, and we can weigh it based.
Which Jesus? The Jesus that drowns babies, or toddlers, or humans in general, as found in the book of Genesis. The Jesus that commands the killing and slaughtering of children and cattle and ox. That Jesus. The Jesus who says that he has predestined the world for either eternal life or eternal damnation. That Jesus. See, Laura doesn't believe those things I just said. But there's a lot of Christians who have a personal relationship with Jesus who do. So which Jesus are we talking about? The Jesus Paul talks about is a little different than the Jesus the Gospels talk about. Am I wrong? So when you say you know, using the historical evidence of who Jesus is and that you can have a relationship with this Jesus, well, yeah, you can, but you can come up with many different Jesuses, or Christs, I should say.
On what is consistent with a God who would become human and die and be raised on our behalf, I think that tells you a great deal about the character of Jesus right there. So I think once we're talking about all those things, it can be, there's actually a lot we can learn about Jesus without, and again, I'm not saying that history is relevant to faith. I don't mean that at all. My point is just that faith cannot be proved with the tools of history, and these central articles of our faith, I think, lie beyond the bounds of history. So.
All right, well, here's one more comment, and this will close us out for today, from Anthony Rowden. He says, thanks, Laura and Mike, for coming on. Hopefully we treated you nice, Laura.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you both for coming on to the channel. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it. It was fun to hear a kind of different perspective, because Laura...
Okay, so that's it. So, yeah. What happened there? What happened there was beautiful. I love this live stream. It was a little boring at parts, but for the most part, it was beautiful because I think it gives Christians a chance, an opportunity to see a version of Christianity that they might not be familiar with. Laura, who loves Jesus, calls herself a Christian, has no presuppositions against miracles, as far as I know, yet says you cannot get to the resurrection of Jesus using the historical method. And I think she would say that it's not sufficient. The claim, a man rose from bodily from the dead, the evidence is not sufficient. What's sufficient for her is the now, the present, seeing, feeling, experiencing, whatever you want to call it, Jesus in the Eucharist. And you'll get that answer from a lot of Orthodox type, Catholic type Christians. So, if you're a non-Christian and you're talking to a Christian and you're talking about the historical evidence, talk about people like Laura and see what the Christian says. Okay, I'll answer some questions. Edwin Nunez says, do you believe we are obliged to appeal to other forms of evidence, though a Christian's ultimate authority is a fact, scripture? Edwin, I'm assuming you're a Christian? No, you don't have to. You're not obliged to, but just know that for guys like me, you're going to have zero impact if all you're using is scripture. That's just... You can say I have a terrible epistemology, so be it. But I think Laura agrees with me there that scripture is not going to do much for you. Okay, I will smoke and mirrors. By the way, I think Laura is a universalist. Thank you, Matt Metro. A lot of people were asking why I was blocked on Capturing Christianity's channel. The last time I remember not being blocked was I said to my live stream audience to go to his channel, and I was blocked after that. So I was trying to give him, legitimately trying to give him more viewers. That's the last time I remember I could type anything on his live stream. See, with Laura as a universalist, she doesn't have that pressure that guys like Mike Licona have to convincing both themselves and others that it's true, because there's not really... I want to say it this way. There's not really much at stake, but a universalist would still say there's something at stake. That is an abundant life today, and there will be a purifying process after you die to get you sinless to get to heaven. Poof. Hey, Camille Greger says there's an after show on Discord. Maybe Laura will show up there. I don't know. Thanks for showing up, guys. Take care.